She's past her prime. The buyers don't want her in the room. That's what my daughter-in-law said to the board, to men in good suits who did not know me, in a conference room I had walked into 1,000 times before anyone in that building had a title. I was sitting at the far end of the table, and I heard her say it the way you hear a car alarm 2 streets over, clear, unmistakable, and somehow still hard to believe was actually happening to you. My son, Marcus, did not correct her. He looked down at a legal pad and drew a small square in the corner of the page. I watched him draw that square, while his wife explained to a room full of strangers that I was a liability to the sale of the company I built with my husband's 2 hands and mine. I was 61 years old, and I want to tell you exactly what I did, because it matters more than what happened after. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I folded my hands on the table, the way Walt used to when a vendor tried to lowball him, and I said, "That's a fair question to ask. Let's keep going." And then I sat there for the rest of that meeting and took notes like it was any other Tuesday. They thought that was the end of it. I know they did, because Priya squeezed Marcus's hand under the table when she thought no one could see, the way you do when a difficult thing has finally gone the way you needed it to go. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and none of this will make sense to you unless I tell it in order, because you need to understand what a company is worth to the people who built it before you'll understand what happened 4 months later, in that same room, when a folder my husband left behind stopped a 9-figure sale cold. And I promise you it wasn't rage that did it. It was paperwork. Stay with me. My name is Elaine Ashworth. I'm 62 now. This happened last year. I need to start with how Walt and I built this thing, because everything after only makes sense if you understand what we actually made. We didn't come from money. Walt was a cabinet maker's son from Dayton, and I was a bookkeeper's daughter from 2 towns over, and neither of us had ever owned anything worth insuring until we were nearly 30. We got married young and broke, and for the first 6 years of our marriage, we ran a single retail furniture showroom out of a leased strip mall unit with a leaking roof. I did the books at the kitchen table every night after our son went to sleep. Walt built half the display pieces himself in a garage that smelled permanently of varnish. By the time Marcus was 12, Ashworth Home Furnishings had 4 stores. By the time he graduated college, we had 11, a warehouse, and a wholesale relationship with 3 regional chains. Walt used to say the company had 2 owners and 1 soul, and he wasn't being poetic. When we incorporated properly in 1992, our lawyer set us up as equal partners, 51% between us in Class B founder shares, with a single clause neither of us thought we'd ever need. Any full sale or dissolution of the company required the written consent of both founders, or the surviving founder, for as long as either of us held those shares. It was standard advice for the era: protect the people who built it from being outvoted by people who didn't. We signed it, filed it, and mostly forgot about it, the way you forget about a fire extinguisher bolted to a wall. Walt died 6 years ago. A stroke, fast, on a Sunday morning while he was reading the paper at the kitchen table where I used to do the books. His shares came to me outright, the way the agreement said they would, no probate fight, no ambiguity. I became the sole founder. I want to be honest that I never once, in 6 years, thought about what that clause actually meant in practice. I thought about missing him. I did not think about paperwork. After Walt died, I stayed on his chair, mostly ceremonial, and let Marcus run day-to-day operations the way we'd been grooming him to since he was 25. He was good at it. Genuinely, better with margins and logistics than his father ever was. I want to say that clearly, because everything I'm about to tell you happened to a competent man, not an incompetent one. Marcus married Priya 4 years ago. She'd come up through retail strategy at a competitor before we hired her as VP of Growth, and she is sharp in a way that has nothing to do with cruelty. She genuinely believes, has believed since the day she walked in, that Ashworth is 1 bad quarter away from irrelevance if we don't modernize. Online first, data-driven, no more showroom floors smelling of varnish. She's not wrong about the market. She was wrong about how she went about fixing it, and about who she decided didn't belong in the room while she did it. It started small, the way these things always do. My office moved from the 2nd floor to a shared space near the break room, temporarily, while they renovated for a new analytics team. My name came off vendor calls I'd handled personally for 20 years, replaced with a note that said decisions were being centralized. I said nothing because none of it was worth a fight on its own, and because I told myself I was easing into something retirement, advisory, whatever word made it feel chosen instead of taken. Then about 5 months ago, Marcus told me a private equity firm out of Charlotte had made an offer for the whole company. Not a partnership, not an investment round, a full acquisition, 9 figures, structured mostly in cash, with an earn-out for Marcus and Priya to stay on as operators for 3 years. He told me this the way you'd mention a weather forecast, already decided, already in motion, already past the point where my opinion was the point. "You'll still have a seat at the table, Mom," he said. "Advisory. Whatever makes sense for you." I said, "All right, let's see what makes sense." I want you to understand that I meant that honestly when I said it. I hadn't decided anything yet. I hadn't even remembered the clause yet. That came later, in an attic, on a night I wasn't looking for it. But that meeting, the one where Priya said I was past my prime in front of strangers, the one where my son drew a small square on a legal pad instead of looking at me, that's the night I stopped meaning it honestly. That's where this really starts. I need to tell you about the 11 weeks between that boardroom meeting and the night in the attic, because people skip past this part when they tell the story back to me, and it's the part that actually explains everything. Nothing dramatic happened in those 11 weeks. That's the point. Nothing dramatic ever does, until it does. The Charlotte firm was called Bramwell Partners, and they were thorough in the specific way that money is thorough, a due diligence team of 4, an associate named Ted who wore the same navy blazer to every meeting, a data room full of spreadsheets that had my late husband's handwriting nowhere in them because nobody had thought to look for it. I sat in on the early sessions because I still technically chaired the board, and I watched Priya run those meetings the way she ran everything, which is to say completely prepared and slightly impatient with anyone who needed something explained twice. I want to be fair to her here, because I've had a year to think about this, and fairness is the least I owe her. Priya did not wake up one day and decide to be cruel to her mother-in-law. Priya woke up every day of the 4 years she'd worked at Ashworth, genuinely afraid the company was going to die of nostalgia. She'd shown me the numbers herself, back when she still thought I'd want to see them. Foot traffic down 18% across our showrooms over 3 years, a wholesale relationship with one of our biggest chains quietly not renewed, competitors half our size outselling us online by using data we didn't even collect. She believed, and she still believes, that Ashworth's only path to surviving another decade was to become a completely different kind of company, leaner, digital, unsentimental. She was not wrong about the disease. She was just willing to be brutal about the cure, and somewhere along the way she decided that brutal meant treating me like a liability line item instead of a person who'd signed the lease on that first leaking showroom. The erosion, once it started, had a rhythm to it. First it was my office. Then it was the vendor calls. Then, in the 6th week of due diligence, it was the Tuesday morning strategy meeting, the one Walt and I had run every single week for 31 years without missing more than a handful, moved to Wednesday at 8, a time Priya knew perfectly well conflicted with my standing appointment with my cardiologist. I mentioned it once, gently, to Marcus's assistant. The meeting stayed on Wednesday. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon, because it's the one I keep returning to. I came down to the 2nd floor to drop off a signed vendor contract, something small, 30 years of habit walking my legs down that hallway before my brain caught up with where my office actually was now. And I passed the old boardroom, the one with the long oak table Walt had built himself in 1994 out of reclaimed barnwood. And there was a woman from the analytics team standing at a whiteboard with Priya, and on that whiteboard, in blue marker, was a timeline. Acquisition timeline, it said at the top, and underneath a series of dates was a line that read, simply Elaine, transition to advisory, and next to it, in smaller letters, TBD comp, TBD equity retention. I stood in that hallway for exactly as long as it took to read it once. Then I kept walking to deliver my contract like nothing had happened. Because nothing had. Technically, I was TBD. I had been TBD for 6 weeks, and hadn't known there was a word for it. That evening, my granddaughter Sophia came by the house. She's 19, home from her first year at State, Marcus's daughter from his first marriage, a marriage that had quietly ended years before Priya ever walked into the company. Sophia had always been closer to me than to either of her parents in the specific way grandchildren sometimes are. Maybe because I was the one who picked her up from school on the days Marcus and Priya were both traveling for the business, back when Priya first joined and the two of them were building something new together, the company, the marriage, all of it at the same time. She was doing her laundry, because the machine at her dorm ate quarters and never gave them back, and she sat at my kitchen table eating cereal at 7 in the evening the way only a 19-year-old can, and she said, out of absolutely nowhere, "Grandma, why does Mom keep saying you're transitioning?" I asked her what she meant. "There's a shared calendar thing on the family iPad," she said, "for scheduling stuff. There's a meeting on there next month that just says closing, Bramwell, and then a note under it that says confirm Elaine off-cap table language before signing." I wasn't trying to look. It's just there when I opened the calendar for my dentist appointment. I asked her not to worry about it. I told her it was probably nothing, a lawyer being careful with words, and she believed me because 19-year-olds want to believe their grandmothers, and I let her believe it because I didn't yet know what I believed myself. But I wrote the date down. Closing Bramwell, next month. And that night, after Sophia left with a laundry basket balanced on one hip and a wave over her shoulder, I sat at that same kitchen table where I'd once kept our books by hand, and I thought about the word transition, and the word advisory, and the word TBD, and I thought about a 51% stake that had somehow become a line item nobody could quite name a number for. I didn't confront anyone that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't wisdom. It was that I genuinely did not yet know what I wanted, or whether I had any right to want anything at all, given how long I'd already stepped back and let Marcus run things his way. Some inheritances aren't money. Some of them are just the habit of staying quiet, passed down so gradually you don't notice you've inherited it until you're sitting at your own kitchen table at 62, doing the math on how small you've let yourself become. That was 3 weeks before the overheard call, and that call is the reason I finally went looking for the one thing in this whole story that Priya, for all her spreadsheets, had never once thought to check. It was a Thursday, and I've never once been able to explain why I remember it was a Thursday except that it was the day I always watered the ferns on the back patio, and I had the watering can in my hand when I heard them. I'd come up to the main house. Marcus and Priya lived 2 streets over from me, in the house they'd bought after the company started doing well, but they still kept a home office in my basement. The one Walt had finished himself back when Marcus was in middle school, full of filing cabinets. Nobody had digitized because nobody wanted to pay someone to do it. I went down there most Thursday evenings to water the ferns Walt had planted along the sunken patio outside that basement door, because nobody else remembered they existed, and because it was, if I'm honest, one of the only places in that house that still felt entirely mine. The basement door was cracked open, and I heard Priya's voice first, clipped and businesslike, the voice she used on calls. "The earn-out structure is fine. Ted's fine with it. The issue is just optics. If she's still listed anywhere as a controlling party, Bramwell's counsel is going to want representations we can't make cleanly." Then Marcus, quieter, the way he always got when he was uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to stop. "She's not going to fight it. She never fights anything." "I know she's not going to fight it," Priya said. "I'm not worried about her fighting it. I'm worried about the paperwork being clean. Can we just get her to sign the advisory letter before the closing date so there's nothing hanging out there?" "I'll get her to sign it," Marcus said. "I'll take her to lunch. She likes when I take her to lunch." I stood outside that basement door with a watering can going heavy in my hand, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt, because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was something closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of hearing your own son describe you as a task to be completed before a deadline. He'll take her to lunch. She likes when I take her to lunch. As if affection and management were the same instrument, and he'd simply learned which one worked on me. I did not go in. I finished watering the ferns, quietly, deliberately, the way you do a task when your hands need somewhere to put the feeling that's rising in your chest. And then I drove home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I went inside, because I did not trust my face yet to walk through my own front door. Here's the thing I want you to understand, because it's the hinge the whole rest of this turns on. I was not in that moment thinking about revenge. I did not yet know there was anything to revenge with. What I was thinking about, sitting in that car, was a much smaller and much older question, one I hadn't asked myself honestly in longer than I want to admit. What, exactly, did I still have that was mine? Not advisory, not TBD, mine. I went inside, and I took out my phone, and I did something I'm not proud of and would do again without hesitation. I opened the shared family calendar, the same one Sophia had mentioned, the one none of them had ever thought to lock me out of, because why would they? I was the one who'd taught half of them how to use it, and I found the entry. Closing Bramwell. 3 weeks out, a Tuesday, 10 in the morning, at the Ashworth headquarters, in the boardroom, with Walt's table in it. I took a screenshot. I don't know why I took a screenshot, except that some instinct in me, some old bookkeeper's instinct that says if it matters, you write it down, told me that date was going to matter more than anything else in my life for a while. Then I called Dana Whitfield. Dana had handled some estate paperwork for me after Walt died, small things, and I remembered 2 facts about her clearly. She was excellent, and she had absolutely no relationship with anyone at Ashworth Home Furnishings. That second fact I would learn mattered more than the first. It was 9:40 at night when I called her. She picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear a dishwasher running behind her voice. And I said, "Dana, I'm sorry to call this late. I think I need to understand something about a company I co-founded, and I don't trust anyone inside it to explain it to me honestly anymore." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a good lawyer, deciding how serious this actually is. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything just because it seems small." So I did. And somewhere around the 15-minute mark, when I got to the part about 1992, about the incorporation, about a 51% stake and a clause I hadn't thought about in 3 decades, I heard her stop typing. "Elaine," she said, "do you still have a copy of the original shareholder agreement?" "Not the current bylaws. The original one, from when you incorporated." I told her I honestly didn't know. I told her it might be in a box somewhere, in the attic, if it existed at all anymore. "Find it," she said, "before that closing date." I mean that as seriously as I have ever meant anything I've said to a client. I hung up the phone at 10:14 that night, and I sat very still in my kitchen for a long moment, and then I got up, and I got the flashlight from the pantry, and I went looking for the attic ladder. The attic ladder in that house had a bad hinge that Walt always meant to fix and never did, and it screamed like something wounded when I pulled it down that night. I stood there in my nightgown at 10:30 at night with a flashlight, looking up into the dark, and I thought, not for the first time in 6 years, that widowhood is mostly just a long list of small mechanical problems your husband used to solve without either of you ever discussing it. I did not find it that night. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I open one box and there it is, waiting, is not what happened. What happened is I climbed up into 31 years of bankers' boxes labeled in Walt's handwriting. Taxes 1998, Wawantu claims, Christmas lights, and I found nothing, and I climbed back down at midnight with dust in my hair and disappointment sitting heavy in my chest, and I told myself I'd try again the next day, and the day after that. It took me 9 days in total to find it, 4 separate evenings on my own, searching alone after dinner with nothing to show for it, and a 5th evening that changed everything, because that was the one my granddaughter decided to climb up there with me. Sophia came by on that 5th evening, the way she'd started doing more often since our cereal conversation, and she found me up there again, sneezing, moving boxes labeled in a dead man's handwriting from one side of the attic to the other. She didn't ask why. She just climbed up after me in her college hoodie and started opening boxes too, and somewhere around 9 o'clock, in a box labeled simply AS Where To, Legal, Original, in Walt's cramped block letters. Underneath a stack of old insurance binders, she found a manila folder gone soft and yellow at the edges, tied shut with a cotton ribbon that had once been red. "Grandma," she said, "is this it?" I sat down right there on the attic floor, on 30-year-old insulation, and I opened it with my hands not entirely steady, and there it was. Shareholder Agreement of Ashworth Home Furnishings, Inc. Dated March 1992, with Walt's signature on the last page in the handwriting I hadn't seen in 6 years, and mine beside it, younger, rounder, a version of my own name I barely recognized as belonging to me. I read it 3 times that night, before I understood what I was actually holding. Section 7, Subsection C, no sale, merger, or dissolution of substantially all corporate assets shall be effected without the written consent of both founders, or in the event one founder predeceases the other, the sole surviving founder, for so long as that founder retains any portion of the original Class B shares. It went on for another 2 paragraphs of dense legal language, but that was the marrow of it. Both founders, or the survivor. Not the board, not the CEO, not whoever happened to be running the company decades later. I needed to understand why, in 30-plus years, no one had ever run into this wall before, so the next morning I called Dana and asked her precisely that question, because I didn't want to walk into anything without understanding the mechanics of it first. She explained it plainly in the way good lawyers do when they're not trying to sound impressive. In 2003, when the company had grown enough to need real corporate governance, Ashworth's outside counsel at the time, a firm Walt and I trusted completely, and had no reason not to, drafted a full new set of corporate bylaws to handle day-to-day operations, board composition, officer authority, standard sale of assets procedures for a company our size. Those bylaws never once said they replaced the original 1992 shareholder agreement, because in the technical sense they legally couldn't, not without both founders formally signing a new agreement to supersede it, which nobody had ever done, because nobody remembered it was still sitting there. It simply went dormant, filed with the state, technically valid, and completely invisible to anyone. Marcus, Priya, even Bramwell's own due diligence attorneys, who only ever thought to pull the current bylaws when they built their transaction documents. Dana told me it happens more often than people think, especially in companies that started as a marriage before they became a business. Old agreements don't die, they just get forgotten by people who never knew to be afraid of them. I had 4 days left before the closing date printed on that shared family calendar. That same week, on a Sunday, Marcus and Priya had us all over for dinner, the kind of dinner where everyone pretends the last several months haven't happened, with Sophia home and the smaller grandchildren running through the yard before dessert. I sat at that table and watched Priya pour wine and talk about the earn-out structure like it was already finalized, already a settled fact of the future, and at one point when I asked, gently, genuinely, not fishing, what exactly my role would look like after closing, she set down the bottle and said, in front of both grandchildren, in front of Sophia, who I could see go very still across the table, "Elaine, honestly, I think it's best if you let the professionals handle the transition. You built something wonderful. Let us handle the paperwork." The professionals, as if I had spent 31 years as an amateur in my own life. I did not say anything at that dinner. I complimented the roast. I asked one of the smaller grandchildren about his soccer game. But I drove home that night with that folder sitting on my passenger seat, where I'd left it that morning out of some instinct I still can't fully explain, and I put my hand on it at every red light between their house and mine, the way you'd touch a locked door to make sure it was still there. I called Dana the next morning and told her I was ready to talk about what happens next. Dana's office was on the 9th floor of a building downtown. Glass walls, no personality to speak of, which I found strangely comforting. I met her there on a Wednesday morning with the folder in a canvas tote bag, because it felt wrong to carry 31 years of my marriage in anything more official than that, and I set it on her desk and said, "Tell me the truth. Is this real? Or am I an old woman who found a piece of paper and built a fantasy out of it?" She spent 40 minutes with it before she said anything definitive. She read the 1992 agreement twice. She pulled up the current bylaws on her monitor, cross-referenced dates, made a phone call to a colleague who specialized in closely held corporate governance, and put me on speaker for part of it so I could hear the answer arrive in real time rather than secondhand. "It's real," she finally said. "It's valid. It's enforceable. And unless Marcus or Priya can produce a document where you formally released or amended these founder rights, which based on everything you've told me does not exist, this deal cannot legally close without your written consent. Full stop." I sat there in that glass office and felt something I hadn't expected, which was not triumph. It was grief, oddly, fresh and specific, because the first thing I thought was that Walt had done this. 34 years ago, my husband, worried about protecting something we'd barely started building, had reached forward through time and put his hand on my shoulder at exactly the moment I needed it, and he wasn't here to see it work. I asked Dana what I was supposed to do with what I now knew. "That's actually the real question," she said. "Legally, you have 3 options. You can go to Marcus right now, privately, and tell him the deal is dead, unless terms change. You can wait until closing and object formally in the room, or you can do nothing and let it close, and forfeit the protection entirely by implied consent, which I'd advise against, obviously." I told her I needed a few days to think, and she said something I've held on to since. "Elaine, I want to say one thing, and then I'll stop giving you advice you didn't ask for. Whatever you decide it because it's what you actually want, not because it's the most dramatic option or the kindest one. You've spent a long time optimizing for other people's comfort. This is not that kind of decision." I did not go to Marcus privately. I want to explain why, because I've turned it over more times than almost anything else in this story, and I still land in the same place. Part of it was practical. Dana was right that a private warning gave Marcus and Priya time to maneuver. to find some argument or pressure campaign or family intervention designed to talk me out of it before I'd fully decided anything for myself. But the deeper reason was that I had spent 5 months being managed, softly, patiently, in a language of TBDs and transitions, and the professionals will handle it, and I had, without ever choosing to, become fluent in going along. I did not trust myself if I gave Marcus a private moment, not to fold the way I had folded in that boardroom, at that dinner table, in 100 smaller rooms before that. I needed the version of this where the paper spoke before I did, so I let the deal proceed. For the 11 days that followed, I went to the office at my usual hours. I sat in on 2 more due diligence calls and said almost nothing. And nobody seemed to notice, because TBD people are not expected to contribute. I had lunch with Marcus, the lunch he'd promised Priya he'd arrange, and he slid the advisory letter across the table to me between the bread basket and the entrees, and I told him I'd read it carefully and get back to him, which was true in every particular and misleading in its entirety. It was during those 11 days that I found the second thing, the thing I want to be very clear I did not go looking for, and did not use the way you might expect. Dana had asked, almost as an afterthought during one of our calls, whether I'd seen the capital expenditure reports for the year, standard due diligence material, available to any board member who asked. I hadn't looked at one in over a year. I pulled them that Tuesday night at my kitchen table, out of nothing more than habit, the old bookkeeper in me unable to leave a stack of numbers unexamined once it was in front of her. And there, in a line item labeled Facilities, Capital Improvements, was a draw of $140,000, approved by Marcus under his own signing authority, routed to a contractor whose name I recognized because he'd sent our family a Christmas card last year. Terrence Boyle, of Boyle Custom Builds, who had, according to his own public website, spent the last 8 months renovating a 5-bedroom house on Larchmont Drive, Marcus and Priya's house. I did not confront him. I did not tell Dana to build a case around it, not yet. I photographed the report, saved it to a folder on my laptop I labeled, with more restraint than I felt, miscellaneous, and I set it aside. Not as a weapon for the boardroom. I had a plan for the boardroom, and it did not need this. This was something else, something I didn't yet have a name for, but I already sensed it belonged to a different, quieter conversation than the one that was about to happen 4 days later in front of strangers from Charlotte. I want to describe those last 4 days honestly, because I think people imagine I spent them feeling powerful, and that is not at all what it was like. I felt mostly like someone standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, certain there were stairs beneath my feet because I could feel the edge of the first one, but unable to see how many more there were or where they landed. I ate dinner with Marcus and Priya twice in those 4 days. I held my youngest grandson on my lap while he fell asleep in front of a cartoon, his weight familiar and warm against my chest, and I thought about the fact that in 96 hours I was going to do something in a boardroom that might permanently change how this particular small body's parents felt about me. I want you to understand I did not enjoy holding that thought. I carried it the way you carry anything heavy and necessary, which is to say badly, and without complaint, because complaining wouldn't have lightened it. Dana called me the night before the closing to walk through the mechanics one final time. She would attend as my counsel. She would bring certified copies of the 1992 agreement, plus a formal letter, drafted and dated that week, notifying Marcus, Priya, the board, and Bramwell's counsel that the sale required my written consent under Section 7C, and that consent was, as of that letter, withheld. She'd sent a copy by courier to the company's registered address that same afternoon, so there would be a paper trail proving I hadn't ambushed anyone. Notice given in writing, before the meeting, exactly the way Dana insisted things be done. "We're not trying to humiliate anyone," she told me. "We're establishing a record. Everything we do so no one can later say you were sneaky about it." I did not sleep more than 3 hours that night. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning, in the same boardroom where Priya had told the Bramwell board I was past my prime, at the same oak table Walt had built with his own hands 3 decades before anyone in that room had been born. I arrived at 9:50, deliberately, not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to seem staged, and I sat down in the chair I'd always sat in, at the corner nearest the window, where the morning light used to hit Walt's face just right during our old Tuesday meetings. The room filled slowly. Ted, the Bramwell associate in his navy blazer, and beside him a senior partner I hadn't met before, a woman named Grace Okafor, who had the particular stillness of someone who has closed a great many deals and doesn't waste energy on small talk. Marcus came in with a leather folder under his arm and the specific brightness of a man who believes the hard part is already behind him. Priya followed a moment later, in a cream blazer, checking something on her phone, radiating the calm of someone who has rehearsed this morning in her head a dozen times and expects it to go exactly the way she rehearsed it. Dana arrived at 9:58, in a gray suit, carrying a slim leather portfolio, and took the seat directly beside me without a word. The papers were laid out. Grace Okafor began, in the measured, unhurried tone of someone reading from a script she's read 100 times before, walking through the closing conditions, the wire instructions, the final signature pages. I watched Marcus's pen hover over the first signature line. I watched Priya's shoulders settle, half an inch, the particular relaxation of a person watching a very long project finally cross a finish line. That was the moment Dana spoke. "Before we go further," she said, in a voice that was calm, unhurried, and carried the specific authority of someone who has done this exact thing before and knows precisely how it goes, "I need to enter something into the record on behalf of my client, Elaine Ashworth. And I want to be clear, this notice was delivered in writing to this company and to Bramwell's counsel yesterday afternoon, so nothing about this moment should come as a surprise to anyone in this room." She opened her portfolio and set 2 documents on the table. The courier receipt first, then beneath it a document I had not seen touch daylight in over 30 years. The folder was still faintly yellowed at the edges, the paper gone soft the way old paper does, and even from where I sat I could see, upside down, the shape of Walt's signature on the final page, the particular slant he always gave the W, unchanged since the day he'd signed it. "This is the original 1992 shareholder agreement of Ashworth Home Furnishings," Dana said. "Section 7, subsection C, requires the written consent of the surviving founder for any sale of substantially all corporate assets. That consent has not been given. As of this notice, it is formally withheld." I watched Priya's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life, and I want to describe it slowly, because it happened in 3 distinct stages, the way these things always seem to when you're watching closely enough. First, confusion, her eyes going to the document, then to Grace Okafor, then back, the particular blankness of someone whose brain hasn't yet found a category to file the sentence into. Then a kind of scrambling reassurance, the corporate reflex, and she said, "I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion. Our counsel reviewed the current governing bylaws extensively. There's no provision." The current bylaws, Dana said gently, were adopted in 2003 to govern day-to-day operations. They never formally superseded the original shareholder agreement, because that would have required both founders' written consent to amend, which never happened. This document has remained in continuous legal effect since the day it was signed. And then the third stage, the one I'd been bracing myself for without knowing exactly what it would look like. Priya turned, slowly, and looked at Marcus, and Marcus was staring at that yellowed document like it was a language he'd once known and completely forgotten. And he said nothing, and his silence in that moment answered every question his wife had ever asked him about whether he'd actually looked into things before promising her they were handled. Grace Okafor set down her pen. "I'll need to confer with our legal team before we proceed any further," she said, in the tone of someone whose entire morning had just quietly, professionally, come apart. "This changes the closing conditions materially." I sat very still in my chair by the window, in the exact spot where the morning light had once fallen on my husband's face, and I did not say a single word. I didn't need to. The paper had finally spoken for both of us. "I need to tell you what happened in the weeks after that meeting, because I think if I stopped at the boardroom, you'd walk away thinking this was a story with a clean ending, and it wasn't. Nothing that involves your only child is ever clean." Bramwell Partners did not walk away from the table that same day, but they did walk away. It took their legal team about 10 days to confirm what Dana had already told them was true, and once they had, Grace Okafor called Marcus directly and told him, professionally and without particular warmth, that a deal built around an unresolved founder dispute carried a level of legal risk her firm wasn't willing to hold, especially with an earn-out contingent on operational continuity that now had a question mark sitting in the middle of it. No dramatic final call, just silence where momentum used to be, and eventually an email from Ted, the associate in the navy blazer, thanking everyone for their time. I did not gloat, and I also didn't feel nothing. I felt the specific, complicated relief of someone who has stopped a train she couldn't see the end of the tracks for, mixed with a grief that surprised me by how long it lasted. Grief for the version of Marcus who might have called me the moment he got that certified letter and said, "Mom, help me understand this," instead of the version who simply hoped it would go away if he didn't look at it directly. Marcus and I did not speak, in any real way, for almost 7 weeks. We managed the way divorced people manage custody, except we weren't divorced. We were just a mother and son who discovered we no longer knew how to be in a room together without an audience of lawyers or children to soften the air. Priya, to her credit, was more decent about the grandchildren than I expected. She never once made my time with them conditional, and when I told her that weeks later, over a stiff, brief coffee, she said, "Whatever else is true, you're their grandmother. I'm not going to make them pay for what happened in that room." I told her I appreciated that more than she probably knew, and neither of us pretended it undid the rest. It was in the 6th week that I finally showed Marcus the capital expenditure report. I did it privately at my kitchen table, no lawyers, no witnesses, because I decided that particular piece of paper was never meant to be a weapon in front of strangers. He looked at it for a long time, longer than reading required, which told me he was deciding something else in that silence, and then deciding not to lie. He told me the truth. The renovation had started before the acquisition talks, funded on the assumption the deal would close and the earn-out money would sort the numbers out retroactively. He hadn't stolen it. Exactly. He'd borrowed against a future that hadn't arrived yet, using authority nobody had thought to double-check. I did not report it to the board. I told him, plainly, he needed to repay it on a schedule we'd set together, and that going forward, any capital draw over a modest threshold required 2 signatures, mine included, written into policy, not punishment, just the ordinary governance the company should have had all along. He agreed without arguing, which told me something too. Some part of him had been waiting, this whole time, for someone to check his math. That conversation was not a reconciliation. It was a boundary, set plainly, accepted without much grace, and it became the only stable ground we had while we figured out what kind of relationship we'd have now that I'd stopped pretending to be smaller than I was. I still chair the board. Marcus still runs day-to-day operations, and does it well, and I say so out loud more often now, because some of what went wrong started with me forgetting to tell him he was good at things unless he was also doing exactly what I wanted. Ashworth Home Furnishings did not sell that year, and hasn't since, though I won't pretend that door is closed forever. What changed is smaller than a headline, and truer than one. I have a real office again on the 2nd floor, no quotation marks around temporary. My name is back on the vendor calls. Once a month, Marcus and I have lunch, just the 2 of us, and sometimes we sit there saying nothing at all, and I've decided that's not failure. That's 2 people relearning a language they let go quiet for too long. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it isn't that I won, because I'm not sure winning is the right word for any of it. It's this: nobody gets to decide when your experience stops mattering just because they've grown tired of asking for it. Age doesn't expire what you build. People simply decide, sometimes without telling you, to stop listening for it. If you've ever watched your own family quietly write you out of a future you helped build, I'd like to hear how you found your way back into the room. And if there's a Walt in your story too, someone who protected you from somewhere they can't reach you from anymore, say something about them below. Thank you for staying with me through this one. There's another story coming, and I think you'll want to hear it.